It is an honor. I'm Leslie Binchamori. I direct the U.S. and America's program here at Chatham House. And it is a very real honor and privilege to be able to moderate this panel. I'm going to try to say not too much up front because we have one short and sharp hour on one of the most important topics of our time at one of the most troubled moments of our time. It feels like there are a number of them, but this is certainly a very significant one. And we have three very distinguished speakers to enlighten us, inform us, and to really begin this conversation. The first, to my left, a friend as well as a very well-known scholar and leading thinker globally on America and its global role. Professor William Wohlforth is Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. He has written more than 60 articles. He has written 9 books. He has contributed to many public studies over many years, not least by the National Intelligence Council. But most importantly for this talk, he's recently written a piece for Foreign Affairs on the myth of multipolarity. And I'm not going to say more because he will say more about that. We then have Ambassador Karen Pierce speaking, who's going to follow on from Professor Wohlforth. Ambassador Pierce, as we know, is currently Britain's ambassador to the United Kingdom. And before this, she was the UK's permanent representative to the United Nations. I consider Karen to be a friend of Chatham House because she has so willingly given her time at a moment where she is very, very in demand and doing some extremely important work for the United Kingdom and for the world. Ambassador Pierce, thank you for taking the time and joining us. Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman is war studies at King's College London, is a friend of Chatham House, is one of Britain's leading scholars, leading public intellectuals, friendliest people, has written many books, led the Chilcot Inquiry. His most recent book, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, please read it, 2022. Does American power have staying power? It's something that, Bill, the world is, America's worried about it. Americans have very different views on this, certainly the Americans that you engage most deeply with and who think very seriously about this. But for those of us sitting here in Europe, in the UK, across the world, it's a really relevant question. It's certainly very relevant right now. And we're feeling the treachery of it every single moment as we get closer, not only as we're in conflict, but as we get closer to the election. So I'm going to turn over to you immediately to get us started.
Well, I won't spend as much time as I should on saying what a distinction, what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with people of such distinction. I'll simply get right to the point and given our time constraint, and talk a little bit about this article, which is entitled The Myth of Multipolarity. And in that article, we argue, my colleague Steve Brooks, also from Dartmouth, you've had a lot of Dartmouth action today. We argue that by looking at economic, military, and technical data, that the United States remains in a position of preeminence in international systems, such that the idea of multipolarity is a myth, and even the idea of a China-US bipolarity is a myth. And the world is in fact closer to unipolarity than either of those two other kinds of international systems. So if I tell you that, then you know what my answer to the question of today's seminar is. It's yes. American power does have staying power. What I want to do in the next just few minutes is to sort of preview why we think this, and then say why we think it matters. Why we think it is because when we look at all of these numerical indicators of capabilities, the United States simply shows up in a position that defies the relevance of the term multipolarity or unipolarity. If we look at economic output, the US and its allies make up 65% of it. The US alone makes up 24%. When we get to the question of longevity, my colleague Brooks, I think of as a very young man, but in fact, I was walking down the street with him this summer in Hanover. It turns out he's 52. And he remarked to me that, my entire life, the US has been at about 24% of world GDP. I was born, it was at 24%. I went through middle school, it was 24%. Now I'm a full professor at Dartmouth, it's 24%. So if that's not staying power, I don't know what staying power is. The US and its allies make up some 65% of global military expenditures. The US alone is at 40%. And in the area of high tech, US firms alone earn 55% of all profits in high tech industry. The US and its allies earn together 80%. of these profits. All other indicators say similar things. Now, I know what you're all thinking. I do, I really do, because I've been giving talks like this for many, many years. And I've been studying American power for many, many years. And your response in your minds, I think, is likely quite similar to that of former US Defense Secretary and CIA Director Bob Gates, who has a recent article in the current Foreign Affairs saying the dysfunctional superpower. So what you're all doubtless thinking is, so what if it has all of this power, if its domestic politics are so dysfunctional that it's capable of exercising that power in a rational, strategic way? And all I can tell you is that I've heard this response to my analyses before. I heard them in the 90s when Bill Clinton was being impeached. I heard them in the 2000s when it was hanging chads and courts determining US elections. I heard this with Gingrich and the Tea Party. I heard this in 2016 with Russian meddling. I heard this with Trump, and I'm hearing it today. And I'm not an expert on US domestic politics. And I can't tell you whether the domestic dysfunction is going to really take us to a position of no return. I can only say that American power is so persistent that despite the fact that its domestic politics is always dysfunctional, yet American power persists. The US economy came out of the pandemic stronger than any other rich economy. That the US inflation and unemployment are lower than other rich economies. US alliances are robust, and they are in fact strengthening. The US has made massive investments in its energy transition. The US is pursuing, as we speak, a relatively coherent grand strategy of reassuring allies, bolstering its position in East Asia and in Europe. And I think that strategy was fairly nicely articulated by Jake Sullivan in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. He's describing a thing that is actually happening. So in other words, this power I described to you is in fact being utilized in a coherent way to pursue a coherent grand strategy that has US interests and allied interests at its center. And meanwhile, how are things with our adversaries? Our authoritarian great power adversaries. Now, no, they're not fully adversaries. Certainly in the case of China, there's a cooperation and a competition agenda. But how do we look at those adversaries? Russia has essentially cratered its claim to great power status with a world historical blunder of invading Ukraine. Its argument that it's been making since the end of the Cold War about its proper place in the world is liquidated by its disastrous decision to invade Ukraine, not really showing authoritarian strategic acumen at its best. China is seemingly bent on never getting out of the middle income trap. No large economy in history has ever exited the middle income trap. That was large, it's a large non-oil exporting economy. No large economy has ever exited the middle income trap without becoming a democracy. Now, before the recent administration of Xi Jinping, I used to go to China a lot, and I would talk to Western business people, and they would all say, yeah, China is different. These people have got it figured out. They know how to maintain authoritarianism and stability, and they're going to break out of the middle income trap. If you would ask a panel of the world's most distinguished economists to make a list of policies that would virtually guarantee that China never leave the middle income trap, the current leadership of China has adopted almost every single one. So that's how things are with the authoritarian adversaries. So this is essentially where I rest my case that the United States is indeed in such a position in international politics that we can conclude that American power is indeed, it persists and it has staying power, and we conclude that the world doesn't look like multipolarity or bipolarity. And you're likely now saying a second question that people frequently ask when I make such talks, and that is, who cares? The world's going to hell in a handbasket. We have really, sort of an epical challenge in the Ukraine war. We have a major challenge in maintaining stability in the US and its allies' position in East Asia. And we have a horrible conflict that is potentially going to get worse in the Middle East. How can this be Pax Americana? And my answer to that is there are two ways in which this analysis that I just spelled out to you still matters, despite the fact that the world does seem to be going to hell in a handbasket. And the first is the analysis we present in that article helps answer those skeptics who say the United States cannot simultaneously help Ukraine defend itself while also safeguarding Taiwan. There is a growing cadre of Republican politicians and analysts who maintain that we really don't have a choice. The United States absolutely must choose, and it must choose its Asian commitments over its European ones. I think that's just not true. And I think if anything, our analysis shows that it's a matter of choice for the United States. And I line myself up with those who think we're making the right choice. However, there is a caveat to this analysis. Those of you, we were just joking, some of the gray-haired folks around here were joking about how we can remember all these old times in international politics. One such time was that period of the early 2000s, America as colossus, America as empire, and the unilateral trend in the Bush II administration's foreign policy. And I think one lesson of the analysis that Brooks and I present is that the real strength of the US position on the international stage comes from its partnership with allies. And if you look at the numbers are especially mind-boggling when the US and its allies act together. And that opens up avenues, particularly for economic statecraft, that the United States cannot do unilaterally. And so that's a kind of caveat. Yes, we can do it. We can continue this approach, but we can't do it alone. We are much more likely to be successful together with allies. The second implication of this analysis is that I think it puts the current challenges, the hell in a handbasket phenomenon, in perspective. And I think that matters for countering extreme pessimism, extreme gloom and doom, and frankly, extreme hawkishness. The most hawkish positions, vis-a-vis especially China, come from the people least confident in American capabilities. The more confident in America's position are, the more room there actually is for diplomacy, flexibility, and accommodation of China. I think real bipolar and multipolar systems, we can show, had revisionist challenges that were far more potentially consequential than what we face in the case of the expressed dissatisfaction of Beijing and Moscow about the current so-called liberal international order. I think those are real. I think they need to be dealt with, but I think they pale in comparison to the kinds of revisionist challenge that we dealt with in the past. So the bottom line here is I think that American grand strategy is not about creating stability everywhere. It's not about preventing all war. It's about reassuring a select set, well, actually it's a very large set of key allies, making them secure, helping them be more prosperous, which helps us be more secure and prosperous at the same time. And I do think that the upshot of the analysis of Brooks and I published is that we do have the capacity to continue to pursue that grand strategy.
Thank you. There's a lot to say there, and that's a lot of and you sort of did tackle the two questions that we all had: dysfunctionality and what are you going to do with that power, or what are we going to do with that power? So thank you for that. You've really put a lot on the table. We will drill down and get very specific, but not until after we've heard from Ambassador Karen Pierce. I have already introduced you, but now that we can actually see you, I have to say, thank you so much, Karen, for taking the time. This is we are very, very glad to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. Hello, everybody. Sorry not to be there in person. Hopefully I'm looking at the camera, so it does look as if I'm participating. I thought that was a fantastic overview by Professor Walford. And there's nothing in that I would disagree with. And in fact, I rather wish I'd said it. I think he is spot on about the staying power of America, not just militarily, but also economically. So I'm hastily revising my remarks because I don't want to go over the same ground. I think one point I would make about American domestic, external performance history is that this is the world's most powerful country, proportionately since the UK probably, pre First World War, and before that it's very fashionable to compare America with the Roman Empire that eventually collapsed from within. I don't think that's what's going to happen in America, much as I think things might be unpredictable and messy for quite a while. But I did want to say that historically, America has crammed history that the Brits and the French and others went through over millennia fundamentally into 250 years. So it's not surprising that you have all these turbulent things, and yet America, since the Second World War, has endured McCarthyism, endured failure in Vietnam, won the Cold War, etc., etc. President Nixon, Watergate. So messiness is, if you like, not exactly the normal default state, but it certainly happens a lot more than we remember when we confront the next problem. So I wanted to put that on the table. I wanted to support what the professor said about allies and alliances. I think this is one of the biggest differences. I would say that America could use that power even more to champion open societies. There is a constituency there among the silent majority of the middle ground, so-called middle ground countries. We don't, I think, do enough to address their concerns about how they manage things like AI and a multi-sector public, private, civil society approach. And we could do more to help them with that and make the case why a transparent, open model will ultimately benefit their citizens more. And America is very good at that. And it would be good to see more of that philosophy coming through. On China, militarily, economically, again, I agree with the professor. I would say that I think we might all benefit from an articulation of a concept towards Taiwan, whether it's containment, whether it's deterrence. At the moment, I think everything again is a little bit messy, and I think it would be very good if somehow, without wishing to return to the Cold War or use the language of the Cold War, it would be good, at least among allies, to have an understanding of what the overriding concept is. And it would be very good to try and persuade to redouble efforts, and America to redouble efforts, to get the Chinese to have the sort of track 2 politico-military dialogues with us, and particularly with America, that it was possible to have with the Soviet Union. And Laurie will remember all the East-West mechanisms that we used to have, and now we need an Asia-West set of mechanisms, like the Pugwash Conference, like others, so that we can reduce the risk of misunderstanding and hence miscalculation. The last thing, two last things, if I may. One is that I think there is a general understanding here in America that the global war on terror as a concept for dealing with problems in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere kind of had its day a bit earlier than we all admitted, and things now need to swing back from a CT first approach to much more traditional security and stability like was originally brought to the Euro-Atlantic area. And I think that's thinking in which all of us need to play some part. Not to say that CT doesn't remain vitally important, as we've just seen with the appalling attack by Hamas. CT is absolutely critical. Sorry, counterterrorism is absolutely critical, and the counterterrorism strategy is critical, but it ought to be a subset of a broader security and deterrence strategy as opposed to leading the pack. And then my last thought would be, for all the reasons the professor and you set out, Leslie, it's overwhelmingly in our interest that America remains the leader on the world stage. That's not to deny China her place. It's not to say we have to have a unipolar world, but we have all benefited enormously from American leadership. And whoever wins in 2024, I think the one thing we should all be doing is urging no retreat in that leadership. On the contrary, we need even more American get up and go to drive consideration of all these very difficult problems of the first quarter of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pierce. I appreciated both of these sets of comments so far, and the specificity of your final points was tremendous. I'm aware that there are many people across the world that don't agree that we need America to continue to be strong and robust, and Bill looks terribly perplexed, but just stay in London a little bit longer. I can introduce you to many of them. They're out there, and there are some solid arguments, and we need to make sure that some of those get on the table today. But before we do that, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman.
Thanks, Leslie. So I'm a historian now. I used to be a political scientist, but I transitioned, and we tend to be a bit tragic in our outlook because power comes and goes, societies come and go, and tough stuff happens. And this is an odd time to be discussing these things, because on the one hand, there's so much to support Bill's argument, and I don't particularly disagree with the main thrust of it, but there wouldn't be much point me being here if I didn't try some words of caution. And I think we have to make a couple of distinctions. The first is what we mean by power. Now, we can have endless discourses on the meaning of power and how you measure it and what the concept's all about, but let me just make one basic distinction, which is power is a general capacity of which the US has more than anybody else and is likely to for the foreseeable future, especially, I'm not sure about the concept of peak China, but China has got so many problems that it's hard to see how it's going to easily catch up now. So power is capacity, military power, economic power, and so on. And then power is a specific application of that capacity, how you use it, what you do with it. And that's where the issue of American staying power seems to me to come in, which was the neatness of the title. It's an odd time because actually on specific application, this administration is really not too bad. It's handled the two big crises that it's confronting at the moment with Ukraine and the Middle East in ways that reflect its domestic politics, which it needs to, all countries must, exercises leadership, and by and large holds its allies together. And I want to say a little bit about the current crisis in the Middle East because I think this is in some ways even a bigger test than Ukraine. So here we have an administration that's not too bad at all, that has an active Secretary of State doing what Secretaries of State used to do, which is move around troubled areas, trying to see if there's a deal. The president that's prepared to take quite strong positions while working the phone. All of these things is what we like to see from an American administration. And then there's that man who's currently sitting in a court in New York, glowering at the proceedings, who may become president in a year's time. Now, personally, I don't think that's the most likely outcome, but it's certainly not one that you can dismiss lightly. And most Europeans sit in trepidation of that possibility, not because it will mean the end of American power in the way that you described it. It will still be the strongest in all sorts of ways. But the specific applications of that power could be pretty catastrophic. Some might view them as being wonderful and liberating, but I'll take the catastrophic line. And the reason for that is it actually goes to the point you made, which he doesn't like alliances. He really doesn't like them. He said so. We know that if he'd had a second term, he was looking to see whether the United States really needed to stay part of NATO. His comments on the two major crises of the day are actually totally incoherent. I mean, it's not that he's pro-Putin. Putin doesn't think he's pro-Putin, but it's incoherent and even less coherent in his comments so far on the Middle Eastern crisis. But he could become the president. And all those so-called adults that were supposed to come in and shore up the Trump last time will now know from bitter experience that they're the ones that will be damaged by the experience. So I think we're right to be a little nervous about this. It tempers my optimism. And the shenanigans in the House, which are already having an effect on the ability of the United States to exercise its power, are things that we need to watch. That being said, let me just briefly say my third thing to worry about, which is neither of these two big crises are over. I mean, so far, I think the Biden administration has done a decent job. The Russia-Ukraine conflict now looks like it could well last until the next administration. The alliance is held together. Ukraine is going to need a lot of support over the next 8 months, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to be through some tough times. But let's assume that we can keep it going, and at some point, because I think actually Trump is waiting to see the results of the next election. Sorry, Putin is waiting to see the next results of the next election. Let's wait and see. He's got to wait and see. Although the recent activity by the Russian army suggests that he's still quite keen to get a solution quickly. Once again, they seem to fail. Let me just quickly say a couple of things about what's going on at the moment, because I think the diplomacy there is very interesting. It's very Biden. He's hugged Israel very closely indeed, and is saying, we support you, we are with you. However, he's a yes, however man rather than a no, but man. And the howevers are really important. Howevers are the immediate questions of humanitarian assistance. Think about the bombing, think about the invasion, but also think about the outcome, the aftermath. And these questions are really very important. There was a fascinating readout yesterday from the call he made with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Very interesting. And if you think about it, here you have probably a more important shift going on than people realize, as what is going on is bringing back to the fore all the Gulf states' worries about Iran. And I think this is going to be part of the challenge for American diplomacy, is whether that can be used, and given a lot of these states now most of them have some sort of decent relationship with Israel, whether that can be used, but it will be used to do things that the Israeli government doesn't actually want. I mean, it wants the support, but it doesn't want a separate Palestinian state. And so this is going to be an absolute challenge for American policy. And if it gets that wrong, then the potential of more upheavals, not just everybody unloading on Israel, but upsets throughout the Arab world are possible. And tensions in Jordan are a very good example of that. Just final point. I think unipolarity, okay. It's not multipolarity in the way that it's normally used, but unipolarity doesn't mean hegemony. Russia talks about the global majority, and the expansion of BRICS is supposed to reflect that. Now, the expansion of BRICS produces an incredibly incoherent organization that I think is largely for show, or it's a way of staying in with China. But there's a set of countries that really don't like the idea that the US is leader, that the US is calling the shots, that the US sets the rules for the world order. They disagree on an awful lot. So I don't particularly see it as a coherent coalition, but it represents a challenge. And it seems to me that part of the sort of diplomacy and statecraft that you say is required, which I agree, is working your way through this group of countries and seeing how you can improve relations so that they don't just think of themselves as a bloc naturally antagonistic with the United States and the West. And here again, the Saudi issue is quite an interesting one, because you will recall as campaigning Joe Biden said some very disobliging things about Saudi Arabia, where he's now trying to make nice to Saudi Arabia, taking tough lines with China, yet now trying to find some sort of way of working with China. So I mean, these seem to be some of the tests of American leadership in practice. They'll stay fine because there they are, nobody can get them, and they have an enormous and powerful economy. In that sense, they'll remain a great and unassailable power. But whether they'll be able to exercise the leadership you wish seems to me to be more to discuss.
Thank you. You will have an opportunity to come back on all of these many things that you've heard since you first spoke, Professor Wolfroth. Let me just say make a quick comment and then open it up to those of you in the room. I mean, I guess I would pick up where you left off, Lori, and as I was thinking through the 4 tasks that Ambassador Pierce has set for the exercise of American power: open societies, a concept towards Taiwan, putting counterterrorism behind a more thoughtful approach to traditional security. Track 2. I mean, these are all things that are about the exercise of leadership that draws on the enormous power that you talked about. And it does seem like, despite the dysfunctionalities that you so eloquently outlined throughout the course of America's history, that there is a difference of dysfunctionality today, which suggests, and it is a question mark, but which suggests that a change of leadership, not only towards Trump, but perhaps towards any of the many different alternatives that we're seeing rolled out on an almost daily basis in the House of Representatives and those that might rise to the top of the so-called Republican Party, would actually lead to a very different kind of leadership than we're seeing from the current president. So leadership in general really does matter what you do with it. And that Jake Sullivan article was quite extraordinary. I mean, and he does lay it out. In an era of geopolitical competition, leadership to bring together some cooperation on the transnational challenges really matters. And that's what America, for better and for worse, but so often for better, has done so well over such a long period of time. And people are afraid that that's not what's going to come down. So America and Americans might be okay, but it's not clear about the rest. And at a time when Europe isn't exactly standing up either, American leadership perhaps becomes even more important. That's a comment, not a question. So I'm going to immediately come to all of you and those online. Gosh, okay. Nick.
Thank you.
First mover.
And also thank you to
Introduce
speakers.
yourself as well, please.
So Nick Greenstock, I run a geopolitical advisory business in London, but globally based. I'm interested in the vectors of power application. So take, for example, the private sector, vibrant in the US, but is part of the way in which the US deploys its power. And so we look at, let's say, for example, the role of an Elon Musk in the US application of power. How is that controllable now? You could say not that different from a Rockefeller or a JP Morgan or in historical terms, but we're looking at the way in which it influences global decision, the information and disinformation. There are wrinkles in the way in which that power is applied. So I'm interested to your sense where government controlled application of power and delivery of that base power versus a kind of disintermediated power application and the lack of control in there.
I think you should take that.
Oh, I thought you were going to gather up more
I will
comments. So
gather more, but I
put the
think
speakers in the
because
great
they're-
position of choosing what
Well,
they
but what I was going to say is that's a moment for you to respond to anything that you've heard since you last spoke.
Well, there's a lot to it. And I don't want to go on too long, but I'll
But
say
choose
that's
your
a
moments, yeah.
fascinating question to make a comparison between non-state actors from the commercial world in the previous epoch versus what they can do today. And everybody notices the story about Elon Musk's role in Ukraine, Starlink provision, how this is a private decision that is related to state actors' national interest or its stated national interest, how calls were made between the White House and this guy who I know through his social media platform, and it's not a really nice thing that you're seeing there on that social media platforms. And now we are pleading with him to undertake a technology transfer in our national interest. So, I mean, that's a really, really fascinating question. My only answer is a really basic one, but it's, I think, borne out by all the debates I've witnessed over my long career, seeing this argument over the relative power of the state. That when push comes to shove, I was going to use a different term, but when push comes to shove, governments do call the tune. And so that totting up the resources, the capabilities of governments, as we do in this article and as I discussed, ultimately does matter, because in extremis, they will compel, if they feel they must, private actors to toe the line. And in fact, you see the United States using its state power to induce private actors to do what it wants when it comes to, I mean, there's not full compliance by any means, but to do what it wants when it comes to so-called de-risking. And we're seeing that across the Western world.
Okay, I'm gonna come to the next, here you go.
My name's John Paris. I want to pick up on Lori's comments on the current crisis. It's really not about the Middle East, it's about Israel. And to understand the crisis, again, you have to understand what a devastating calamity this is and what a loss of deterrence this is. To see Israel suffer 1,400 casualties, nearly all civilian, nearly all old people or young people, many of them babies. To restore that deterrence will require certain actions by Israel. The United States understands that. So when you say the United States is saying yes, but I think the Israeli answer will be, well, we'd like you to support us and we will do what we can. We'll delay this, but we will do what's necessary to restore our deterrence, because Hezbollah will or will not enter the war, not because of US warships, but because they will be afraid that what's going to happen to Hamas will happen to them, as it did in 2006. In other words, they're more afraid of real Israeli power unleashing real damage to Lebanon than they are of these theoretical warships that may or may not be used. So that's point number one. Israel will go it alone without Biden if they have to. They have a window here because they have the support of Biden and they have this cause. And they've paid, as Amos Yadlin says, they've already paid the price. So when you say it's too much of a price to go into Gaza because you lose all those soldiers, they've already paid the price. So they're going to move, I think, to restore the deterrence. So how do you restore deterrence? That's my question. It's so difficult when you lose something so valuable. How do you get it back? Will it take just this war, or will it take a series of war, or will ultimately take, escalating until they really defang the Iranian nuclear program, which is, I think, the end goal of Israel right now.
Yeah, I think you must.
This is why historians have a tragic sensibility, because sometimes you can't. This is a tragedy that's taken decades in development. So the question that the Biden administration has been putting is, fine, you get to Gaza City, and then what do you do? And that's the question that, that Israel can beat countries up, we know. And I think Hezbollah is still I don't think the warships are irrelevant. They knocked out some Houthi missiles, apart from anything else. Apparently, so did the Saudis, one of them. But the question is, what next? It's the aftermath issue, and the American press is full, and the Israeli press too. It's not just the Israelis. So the tragedy of these situations is sometimes there aren't good answers. It's all suboptimal, and I think that, to be honest, I think that's the case. And the only way you go forward is a political. And the problem for Israel is it hasn't had a political strategy for dealing with the Palestinians for decades. And what I suspect is going to happen, and let's be clear, everybody was expecting the Israelis to move by now. It's their decision not to, in terms of the invasion of Gaza. My guess is that the political outcome of this, if it involves some sort of international coalition managing Gaza, which is the best outcome I can imagine, is leading to a much stronger Palestinian entity. That seems to be where it'll go. And Netanyahu has spent his career trying to stop that. So, one thing about foreign policy is most of it's suboptimal.
Maybe I could just follow up on that, and then we're going to come to Professor Cox. What's at stake for this broader question in this, and how this turns out for America's ability to exercise its power and influence?
I think American power,
No.
I think American power depends on getting some outcome along the lines I've just described. I think it's important both domestically and in Israel to be seen to be supporting Israel. but internationally, Israel is not the most popular state, and an outcome that actually produces a more stable situation seems to me to be one that will require concessions from Israel, political concessions from Israel, that up to now they felt able to avoid. So it's a real test of American power in that sense. If it just ends up doing what we're doing at the moment, with life being made more miserable for people in Gaza and more bombing, without any obvious political outcome, that's not going to be a success for American power.
And I'll just say one thing and then we'll come to you. And this could take a very long time to play out, and it could play out in another administration,
Potentially.
which could have a very.
Although by and large, these crises don't last because you can't sustain this sort of situation indefinitely.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I agreed with everything, but I'll take you back to an article you wrote in 1987.
Enlighten us.
Sorry about that. Where you talked about the origins of the First World War and perceptions. And I think maybe there's one thing, I agree with all the empirics. I'd add even more empirics, universities, the dollar, and many, many other things. Plus geography makes a big difference too. But on the perceptions question, I think you need to tease that out a bit, going back to your 1987 article, because objectively speaking, to use a comradely term, everything you say is true, but in terms of perceptions of the United States and understandings of American power and its staying power, I think there has been a change and there has been a shift. And I think that does make a difference to where things are at the moment. Now, when it began, was it the 2008 crisis? Was it the collapse of the whole Iraq strategy? You know, was it the time of the Trump administration? But perceptions of America are not quite the objective, coincide with the kind of objective stuff you're talking about. And I think that is important because around the world, it does seem to me there are a lot of people, including inside the United States, by the way, and most of my students at the LSE, I would also add to that, you know, who don't agree entirely with what you're saying. They do think that there is a drift in the American-led order, that the United States, in a sense, has lost the plot, however much power it may have. So point one, Bill, just to bring you back to your perceptions article. Where do perceptions fit into this at all? Because what you've got is very objectivist, and I totally agree with that. But does that explain the whole story? The second point comes back to Laurie's point. I'll be brief. On the question of hegemony, the question of power, a difficult one to define, but it's also about who sets the rules and who follows the rules. And it seems to me here again, the US is, although in still a very strong position, objectively speaking, nonetheless, in terms of rules, following those rules, who follows those rules and who challenges those rules. There's more people questioning those rules now than I've heard for a very, very long time indeed. Not only China, not only Russia, large parts of the global south and everybody, a lot of other people in the world. So that's about hegemony, isn't it, Laurie? I mean, and it seems to me that has to be integrated into your kind of notion. So I agree with the fundamentals of what you're saying, but I want to take you back to 87 and perceptions and bring Laurie back in again on the question of the rules. Are they following the rules? Is everybody following the rules that America is laying down? And I kind of get a feeling that not everybody is at the moment. And by the way, on the Middle East question, it could be the United States will lose a lot more friends or even neutrals in the world, the way this crisis in the Middle East is working out, rightly or wrongly.
Hold on that, because that's a very important comment, but I'm going to make you hold. Mark Landler and Peter Westmacott, and then we'll come to Ambassador Pierce and Laurie and Bill. And I have Mary on the list for sure, but I'm not going to put three of you together.
Thanks. I really have more of a question than a comment, which is, I think when we talk about Trump sometimes as though he's this aberrant figure that comes in and imposes an utterly alien worldview on the US. We hate alliances, we're bullies. I always wonder to what extent he is that, or in fact, he's a reflection of what a substantial portion of the population believes. And if that's the case, which I think it is, I also wonder whether we shouldn't assume that there will be a bipartisan consensus for the role that the United States can continue to play. It feels to me a little bit like Biden is almost relying on muscle memory in the way he's dealing with the Middle East and Ukraine. And if you look at the debate in Congress, it seems more and more detached from what the White House views as the right approach. I mean, you can't just dismiss the Republican Party as crazy because they don't want to continue to support Ukraine. So I guess this is a long-winded way of asking you, when you think about the continuing application of American power, how much of the calculation is based on whether there's still a public consensus behind the US playing this role? And if there isn't, for any number of economic reasons or whatever, then doesn't it not matter? I mean, if we can be powerful, but we choose not to, then, you know, we're simply not going to play that kind of role. That's the question.
Thank you, Peter Westmacott. A rather similar point to what Mark was making. I go along with what Karen says about the importance of continuing American leadership role in the world for all the reasons that others have touched on. But I'm also very conscious that both the candidates last time round were running on something of an America first foreign policy platform. Joe Biden, let's look at Afghanistan, didn't want to get involved anymore in faraway wars which were costing a lot of money and a lot of lives, and for which the American public opinion didn't have much of a stomach. Many of us can disagree with the way in which he picked up the poison chalice that Trump had left him on Afghanistan, but nevertheless, he was reflecting, I believe, not only his own instincts, but also a lot of the sense in America that this is somebody else's problems. And so I think that I agree he's done a very good job so far in dealing with the international crisis, which he probably would have much rather not done. And bearing in mind the relationships which he's had with Bibi Netanyahu in the past, who after all actively campaigned against the Obama team and against Biden, I think the hugging close, and by the way, guys, here's the way in which I think you need to go from now on, is extremely sophisticated. I think it's worked well. The muscle memory that Mark talks about, I think has served this president extremely well. He's been around the block after all. He knows what he is doing. So I think we're doing very well, despite the fact that public opinion, rather as Mark is suggesting, may not be all that keen on America continuing to play that role. But the bit that bothers me is the Trump element. Now, I think I heard Laurie say that Putin doesn't think that he's his friend, and that Trump may not be that close to Putin. I think that Putin is actually not seeking an early solution in Ukraine because it's too difficult. I think he's waiting it out. I think he's waiting for his, I'm sorry to say, buddy, Donald Trump, to win, at which point America loses interest pretty much overnight in Ukraine, despite the fact that in the upper house, in the Senate, and to some extent in the House, the elected representatives of the American people are still strongly pro-Ukraine, but there is a degree of Ukraine fatigue beginning to set in, I'm sorry to say, in a number of different countries. And I think that is the Putin strategy. And if we get Trump back, then I worry not only that he's going to drive a coach and horses through the alliance structures, which is what he tried to do last time, we'll try and do that again, that he will leave Ukraine in a lurch, and the rest of us will not be able to prop up Ukraine against Putin on our own. I'm sorry to say, that is the reality. So you end up with a stronger Russia, not just a gas station with nuclear weapons, but somebody who's actually, I'm sorry to say, having a real impact in that part of the world. So I think what I'm really asking is, are we not being a little bit sanguine about the possibility of America remaining that benevolent, significant leader in the event that, because we mustn't exclude it, as the professor was just saying, we mustn't exclude the possibility that Trump could win again. But in the event that he does come back, I feel we may be dealing with a different sort of America, unwilling and unable to exercise that leadership role, which the rest of us continue to believe is important.
We are hearing these concerns loud and clear. We are definitely going to have another round, and Mary, you'll be at the start of that, but let's come back to the panelists. Ambassador Karen Pierce, would you like to go first or second in the responses?
I don't mind, Leslie. You
I'll let you
run
go
this how
first.
you like.
I'll let you
Okay,
go
well, thank
first.
you. And thanks, everybody. And again, I find a lot to agree with in what's been said. I do think we have a problem with trade. We have a philosophical problem with Americans on trade, to be honest. And I don't think it appeared with Biden. I think historically, it probably, this America first, the protectionist approach, or overly protectionist approach, I think came started to come with Reagan. I remember Clinton getting NAFTA through, and what a big deal that was at the time politically. America has always used tariffs in a very different way from how we would, but we will have a continuing problem with America first, whoever wins the election, because I think it's caught up with the whole question of supply chains and economic security. And if you're as big as America, you think you can onshore a lot more than actually it's healthy to do so, quite apart from the point that it's in America's interests that her allies have strategic industries and competitive industries. So I think we're going to have to keep fighting to get that narrative understood, and we're going to have to keep pushing back on protectionist measures. There is a body in Congress around the Ripon Society types who are for free trade. We need to do a lot more to empower them and get them to speak up. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I think on Ukraine, I agree with Peter. There is a solid body in Congress, House and Senate, who will vote for a Ukraine package if the administration and the congressional leadership get the package and the tactics right. And those two quite sizable ifs, but nevertheless, the support is there. I agree with Peter that I do think Putin is waiting to see if Trump comes back, because then he thinks he'll have many more options to carry on doing what he wants to do. Trump himself has said he would offer Putin a deal, but if Putin didn't take it, then Trump would revert to the policy of doubling down on Ukraine. I don't know if that would in fact be the case. I think there must be some doubt about that. But I think the argument for America and American people is that they will want our help on China. They will want our help on Taiwan. That doesn't have to be a live question, but they will want us to help do the contingency thinking with them, and they will want us to help economically, just as the G7 countries were very well coordinated on sanctions on Russia. So I do think that is an incentive, even for an isolationist administration. I do think they reflect a view in the American people, but it's not a universal view. I mean, you think that America, Congress and the administration at the time had to campaign very fiercely to get the United Nations over the line in the 1940s. So there is a case to be made, and it's not been made as strongly as it could be. But that's not to say we don't have agency in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill.
Well, I'm really grateful to the Ambassador for making that remark. That last remark is really crucial. And that puts the lie to the idea that the decisions regarding Ukraine and decisions regarding Taiwan are somehow independent of each other. If we, the United States, are not helping Europe secure itself, we can expect in return less European cooperation if we want Europe's help in dealing with things in Asia. So these two theaters are not, as many Republican strategists and some Republican strategists and politicians argue, independent decisions. And as was pointed out, Europe cannot immediately step into the breach if the United States pulls back. So some quick responses to these excellent remarks on perceptions of power. First article I ever wrote, Paul Kennedy was I wrote that for a seminar for Paul Kennedy's class. We were just speaking about dear Paul. Yes, perceptions of power move around. That's why we wrote the article. We wrote the article because perceptions are getting wacky with this multipolarity stuff. Now, I'm totally agree. If you say multipolarity means, well, there's lots of things in the world, there's lots of actors, there's lots of states that matter, then sure. But actually, if you talk about multipolarity as the number of countries with substantial, massive military, economic, and technological lead over others, it doesn't apply to the current international system. So perceptions will vary, but they tend to vary around actual military and economic and technological capabilities. So very quickly, Vladimir Putin had an idea, and that was that the West was weak, the United States was weak. And you have to understand, his motive in Ukraine wasn't about just Ukraine, with all respect to Ukraine, it was about reordering European security. He thought it was time. He thought we didn't have the capacity to stop him. He was tired of this NATO-dominated European security architecture. And Russian preferences were revealed when they put their diplomatic demarches on the table in the lead up to the war. That's what they wanted. What do they get? In other words, he tested power. He had his perception of power. We had our perception of power. His was wrong for the reasons that we identify in the article. Regarding absolutely the leadership issue, the possibility of a Trump presidency, having to bear in mind these contingencies, I share absolutely everybody's concerns. I will say, though, that I would emphasize what Professor Friedman said, incoherence. I am not so sure that he's actually got a coherent view that he's totally immediately going to pull out of Ukraine. I see this as a far more, there's a vision there of making a deal. And when he doesn't get the deal, if he indeed gets to the White House, when he doesn't get the deal that he wants, all bets are off of what he does next. And that's what happened last time, by the way, on both South Korea and in Europe and with Putin. So again, I completely agree with all of the apprehensions spread around the table concerning what might happen in a new administration led by Donald Trump. But I'm a little less alarmist for the reasons that I just stated. And finally, the final point is, what's the use of doing all this analysis when there are so many Americans who are isolationists, when there are so many Republicans who are moving away from their party's mainstream? The mainstream, certainly in the Senate especially, remains very international, it's very committed, but there's a growing group that does not. What's the point of all this power? The point of our article is to defeat the arguments that these people are making. And the point is that if you are going to argue to us that we don't have the capacity to do these things, you are wrong. Does that mean that our argument will win in a domestic debate? I can't guarantee that, but that's where this analysis is important. We're academics, we come into it only with our attempt to bring some evidence to bear on one of the arguments at stake here.
Actually, I think that line needs to be the first line of every talk in every article, because it's a little bit buried. I think it's a little bit buried, but it's
So
actually
we get too lost in our academic concepts, yeah.
very important though.
Briefly, I was pleased that Karen made the point about trade, because that's where America first really makes itself felt. That's where it really matters to the American people, I expect. I mean, most people, most of the time, don't spend a lot of time thinking about foreign policy. Occasionally, it's all very dramatic and in the news, assuming they're watching the news, not on YouTube channels. So I'm not, I think trends in Congress matter, and broad trends, but I mean, broad trends in polling are not that bad. There isn't Ukraine fatigue. I mean, the most remarkable thing so far has been how little Ukraine fatigue there has been, because Putin keeps on making the argument why he's got to keep it up. I mean, I agree with Peter about what Putin wants. I mean, I was quoting Putin from things he actually said, pointed out that Trump had increased sanctions against Russia. And I think the general, I mean, anybody who relies on the prediction of what Trump will do is a fool, because he will do what he wants to do. It's totally egotistical, and depends on his mood and who slighted him. I mean, look at his reaction to the crisis in the Middle East. It was all about the fact that Netanyahu had endorsed Biden when Trump said he hadn't won the election. His whole reaction to the situation was based on that. So, you know, what sort of a man is that? Final point about perceptions. These are important, but what's always fascinating to me is how they shift from presidency to presidency, especially in Europe, because we've got good polling on that. I mean, by the time he left office, Biden was the most popular politician that Europeans could imagine, still was sometime later. I don't think he was a great foreign policy president, but that's however, because he represented something. Obama, sorry, it's age. Obama was.
By the time he left office, Obama was the most powerful, most
Correction.
popular
Got it.
president.
Correction.
Delete.
However, that was based on a view of what we like America to be, the sort of people we want Americans to be. And Obama represented that when he spoke. He was articulate. He brought people together. It was what people like to hear. Whereas Bush and Reagan, less so. So perception is not just about the quality as a foreign policy president. It's whether they represent those qualities in the United States we really like and we really would like to see come to the fore.
There is so much to say about that, but we will hold it for one final question from Mary Dejewski. Two final questions, and then we'll come right back to the panel and close.
I'm actually passing on my question because it's it was basically an amalgam of the questions that were asked in the previous round about how long American power could actually last if there was no political will inside America to exercise it. But that's
I'm
really
glad
been
you
asked.
put that back on the table because it is extremely important. And here we go.
American power, and accepting your article, not be applied, if we look at the application, in a much more effective way. If we look at the way this global south reacted to the Ukraine situation, and we look at the opening related to Belt and Road and the bad financing, shouldn't we step in there and be much more proactive and active from this? America was the shining city on the hill, and we didn't have these questions on democracy and Trump and all these other things. And America would stand up more to the populists running from Hungary to Turkey to other places. Wouldn't it be much easier to apply that power?
Two quick more comments right here, and then a final word from
Professor, on the same line, just assume United States were defeated in the Middle East and in Ukraine. Will you still have this opinion and the global south turned against US? Will you still have the opinion?
please.
Yeah, I guess William mentioned the most hawkish people have the least confidence in America, and I guess why do you think there is this insecurity almost, whether it's the trade policies towards China, is this insecurity because of what's happening internally in America, like what we discussed about a lot tonight about Trump, or is it because of this insecurity, worrying about the rise of China and the relationship that China has formed with those middle ground countries that Karen mentioned as well?
I think we'll just get a final response from all three panelists and anything that you'd each like to say. And Karen, once again, I'm going to begin with you, and this will bring us to a close. This has been tremendous.
Okay, thanks very much, Leslie. And I'm afraid I'll have to run once I've given these remarks. Apologies for that, but I have another engagement. I don't know that I've anything new to say. I think America needs to recover its narrative, as we were saying. It is a shining city on the hill, or has a potential to be. And most of what happens inside America is not, of course, communicating with the outside world at all. It's all about American domestic politics. But the outside world has a tendency to think that America is always talking to it, as opposed to sorting out its own problems. And the risk of that is obviously the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation by those like the Chinese. More could be done by America to highlight the bipartisanship. They passed some very important legislation this year, including on a bipartisan basis. I'm sure we'll hear more of that in the campaign. But to come back to where I started, our own security is greatly enabled by American leadership. Even if you take the moral and values, liberal democracy dimension out of this, there are very good reasons for us to keep tacking very closely to America. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Lori and then Bill to close.
Not much else. I mean, on these particular questions, I think one of the problems goes back to the vision thing, as Bush Jr. put it. you do need a narrative, which there used to be one. I don't think it's easy just to construct one because you feel you need one. They have to arise rather naturally. And I think that's difficult at the moment. I mean, I think that is part of the problem. That the limits of American power and the limits of American society have been shown up. I mean, you talk about views of the United States, and they're about gun control and the health system and political dysfunction, rather than necessarily about foreign policy. And that's why I think that's part of the challenge, and the inability of successive American governments to stop random shootouts every few weeks that everybody says this mustn't happen again, and it keeps on happening. I think that's the sort of thing that undermines the American narrative. So it's difficult to construct one, but there's things to talk about, and part of it is, I think, is accepting countries, all of us, as messy, fallible, disorganized, but we do the best we can.
Thank you. Bill.
Super quick response is not going to be very satisfying, but I mean, hypocrisy is the fundamental necessity of leadership. And every leader in international politics will be hypocritical, and they will be called on it. And that's just the price of the game. I mean, I think if you're going to say that the United States has to be utterly consistent in its relations with the so-called rules that it supports, in order to gain favor with the global South, it's never, ever going to do that. And I think if you have as the measure of American power solving the Middle East crisis, peace in the Middle East, then America was never a superpower in the first place. We've never been able to do it, and we're not going to be able to do it now. And I guess the final point I would make here is that while I believe that American power is expansive, I believe that American grand strategy has to be concentrated. You have to keep your eye on the ball. The ball is maintaining those core alliances, making sure they are secure, making sure people have confidence in the United States commitment and credibility, and not solving every single problem in the world. You can't have your grand strategy be peace and justice everywhere, because then you'll end up having it nowhere.
Thank you. That was sobering and very, very, very wise. Thank you very much from all three of you. It's tremendous.